They had gathered to mourn the deaths of 2 men and became victims themselves. A suicide bomber attacked a funeral in northern Iraq early on Thursday, killing at least 60 people. It's the latest in a spate of deadly bombings this week, raising fears of a new campaign of violence in the north. Owen Fay has the latest.
The attacker walked into a tent crowded with mourners, then detonated the explosives strapped to his body. The wounded were quickly taken to local hospitals, and survivors described a scene of absolute carnage, with the dead and wounded flung in every direction. They had been attending the funeral of local tribal leaders, active in efforts to rid their district of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. The funeral was being held in a small village near Baquba, capital of Diyala province. For months, this region has been relatively calm, with no major attacks since the beginning of the year. But that calm was shattered earlier this week. Exactly 48 hours before the attack on the funeral, a suicide car bomber targeted a courthouse in Baquba itself. Scores were killed in that explosion. And that attack was quickly followed by 2 car bombs in Mosul, one in Baghdad, and a suicide bomber in Ramadi. Like this attack on the funeral, each of these were believed to be the work of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, targeting groups and individuals trying to drive them from the country. Meanwhile, in the Iraqi capital, military operations against Shia militias continue. This has been the focus of the Iraqi security services in recent weeks. Fresh fighting overnight in Sadr city, including an airstrike by an American unmanned drone against forces loyal to Shiite cleric Muqtada al-Sadr. In the past few weeks, more than 100 people have been killed within Sadr city itself.
Taken together, what these incidents appear to show or to reveal are the challenges facing the Iraqi government and its security services. Because while Washington is right now boasting about the success of its surge strategy, what may very well be happening, as many people here predicted, is that the Sunni groups, which were active here in Baghdad and in the surrounding regions, have simply moved to other regions where they've been able to regroup and now are capable of launching attacks again, and that's what appears to be happening in Diyala province. The Shiite militias, by contrast, appear to be becoming ever more entrenched in places like Sadr city and further to the south in Kut and in Basra. And that's leading to fears, particularly when it comes to these various Sunni militia groups, that many people here have been saying for some time, that while we may have seen a pause in the violence, we've certainly not seen an end to it. Owen Fay, Al Jazeera, Baghdad.
The Israeli military is about to seal the West Bank and Gaza, barring Palestinians from heading into its territory as it prepares for the Jewish Passover. But it's locking in seething anger and many questions over the actions of its military in the past 2 days. Tanks and soldiers have been on the move near the border areas over the past few hours. Israel says its troops thwarted an attack by Palestinian fighters on a border crossing point at Kerem Shalom, where humanitarian supplies are brought in. 1 fighter was killed and another wounded, but it's what happened on Wednesday that's put Israel under fire. At least 20 Palestinians were killed, including several children and a cameraman from the Reuters news agency. Pictures appear to show he was deliberately targeted by the Israeli tank, and thousands turned out for his funeral. Jackie Rowland has been following today's events.
They still can't quite believe it. Their young colleague, Fadel Shana, 23 years old and full of life, is no longer with them. Journalists in Gaza, so used to reporting the tragedies of others, have now lost one of their own. For Fadel's employers at the Reuters news agency, there are questions that the Israeli army needs to answer.
We're asking the army to explain, was that aimed at the position where Fadel was filming? Why did that happen? Clearly our concern is to protect our journalists and to ensure that such tragic events are not repeated.
Lifted high above the crowd, the body of Fadel Shana is taken from a Shifa hospital for one final journey. The procession of mourners grows bigger as it advances through Gaza City. Journalists, friends, ordinary people touched by this conflict. And bearing the stretcher, Fadel's colleagues from Reuters, who worked with him every day. The journalists reporting from Gaza are almost all local Palestinians, and they take big personal risks to let the world know what's happening here. Now these journalists are finding themselves the target of attacks. The Israeli army has expressed sorrow at the death of Fadel Shana. It says its forces do not deliberately target journalists.
You have to take into consideration when we're talking about a war zone, when there's exchange of fire and journalists are hanging around in those places, that sometimes as a result of these consequences, journalists will be hit.
These are the final images from Ferdal's camera before he films the tank shell that kills him. His colleagues arrive at the scene. Their distress and outrage is palpable. Ferdal and his team were travelling in a car that was clearly marked with the words press and TV. The question now, did the Israeli soldier in the tank see those signs? Jackie Rowland, Al Jazeera, Gaza.
Well, as we saw in Jackie's report, the tank fired right at Fadel Shana. Doctors say he was killed by flechettes. Now, these are tiny metal darts, several centimetres long. They're packed inside a tank shell and are fired out in their thousands when the shell explodes. They can spray out for hundreds of metres and they're highly controversial. In 2003, Israeli doctors and Palestinian human rights groups went to the Israeli Supreme Court to try and get them banned. But the court ruled that the UN Convention restricting weapons that cause excessive injury did not specifically prohibit what they call sub-ammunition, such as flechettes. The Israeli rights group B'Tselem argues that the judges ignored basic rules of international law. In other words, the obligation to distinguish between those who are involved in fighting and those who are not. Charles Endelin, who's worked in the region for many years for France 2 television, says the type of weapon fired at Fadel Shana on Wednesday is always likely to kill civilians.
They hit over a wide area. They are very dangerous. They kill, they maim, and they endanger not only the fighters from one side, but also the civilians who are around them. You know, Gaza is a very populated area. Wherever you go, whenever anything is happening, you have always civilians around you. You have always children walking around, whatever happens, shooting or fighting. So when you use such weapons, you know you are going to hit civilians.
Zimbabwean opposition leader Morgan Tsvangirai is calling for South African President Thabo Mbeki to be removed as mediator in Zimbabwe's post-election standoff. Tsvangirai, who claims he won the presidential poll, says he's asked Zambian President Levi Masawana to launch a new initiative. His call comes as a spokesman for Mbeki's government is calling for the results to be made public, describing the situation in Zimbabwe as dire. Previously, Mbeki had been reluctant to criticise the delay in Zimbabwe. Kenyan Prime Minister Raila Odinga has been sworn in as part of the country's power-sharing deal. President Mwai Kibaki named Odinga as Prime Minister on Sunday. He takes office along with more than 40 ministers in the new cabinet. The deal follows weeks of wrangling over ministerial positions. The centre of Delhi was in lockdown all day on Thursday as Indian authorities made way for the Olympic torch. 70 runners held the torch for just a few seconds each as the route was cut down to avoid protests. India is home to the world's largest exiled Tibetan community, but their demonstrations were largely kept away from the Indian leg of the run. Matt McClure reports.
On the march towards the heart of the capital, thousands of Tibetan exiles and their supporters from across India. A parallel protest to the Olympic torch relay, carefully watched each step by a cordon of police.
Indian authorities are walking a tightrope. In the world's largest democracy, they feel duty-bound to allow these protesters on the street. But at the same time, they don't want to offend Chinese authorities, and they say the official torch relay will not be disrupted.
The center of the city is sealed off hours before the event. Some 15,000 police and soldiers line the route. When Indian athletes and Bollywood stars carry the torch down a shortened 2.3-kilometer route from the presidential palace to India Gate, only a few spectators are there to watch. Still, it all goes off without a hitch. The protesters who organized the parallel relay, which began with a prayer for peace at Mahatma Gandhi's memorial, insist they never planned any violence and that Indian authorities overreacted to please their Chinese neighbors.
The way the police has been, following us, asking questions, calling us, they have been calling us in the middle of night about our activities. It seems the government is paranoid about,